I never imagined the man who walked back into my home after war would feel like a stranger. And yet something more. When Alex's gaze lingered on me just a second too long, I dismissed it. But then came the words that left me breathless. No one could ever make me feel the way you do. Alex had always been my rock, a cheerful, adventurous boy with a knack for making everyone smile. Growing up, he had his father's charm and my fierce determination. Our bond deepened after his father passed away, leaving just the two of us to weather the storm of grief. I became his world, and he became mine. For years, our home was filled with laughter and warmth. I supported Alex through school, his first heartbreak, and eventually, his decision to join the military. Saying goodbye at the bus station was one of the hardest moments of my life, but I smiled through my tears, promising myself I'd be strong for him. "You'll always have a home here," I said, hugging him tightly before he left. When he returned years later, he was a different man. War had shaped him, adding a quiet gravity to his presence. His once boyish face was now sharper, framed by a shadow of stubble that made him look older than his 25 years. The confident sparkle in his eyes had been replaced by a distant, unreadable expression. The first few days after his return were quiet. I gave him space, not wanting to push him to talk about the horrors he had seen. But I couldn't ignore the way he looked at me, intense, protective, and tender all at once. "Mom," he'd say, his voice steady but softer than I remembered. "You don't know how much I missed you." I chalked it up to relief, to gratitude for being back in a safe place. But then there were the moments that made me pause. The lingering glances when he thought I wasn't looking. The way he'd offer to help with chores, his hands brushing against mine just a second too long. His compliments, casual at first, then more deliberate. "You look beautiful today," he said one morning, his eyes lingering on me in a way that made my heart flutter and my mind race. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was the trauma talking. But deep down I couldn't shake the unease or the dangerous thrill that came every time he stepped closer, his warmth enveloping me like a safety I hadn't felt in years. At first, I told myself it was all in my head. Alex had been through so much, and I didn't want to overanalyze the subtle changes in his behavior. But as the days passed, it became harder to ignore the small moments that set my heart racing and left me questioning everything. It started with the little things. Alex had always been affectionate, but now his touch lingered in ways that felt different. When he brushed past me in the kitchen, his hand would graze my back just a little too slowly. When he helped me carry groceries, his grip on my shoulder was firm, almost possessive. "You're always doing so much," he'd say, his tone low and sincere. "Let me take care of you for a change." One evening, I was folding laundry in the living room when Alex walked in. He stood silently for a moment, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place. "What is it?" I asked, trying to break the tension. "You're amazing, you know that," he said, his voice soft but unwavering. "You've always been so strong, so beautiful." I laughed nervously, brushing off his words. "Don't be silly, Alex. I'm just your mom." But his gaze didn't waver. "You don't give yourself enough credit," he said, stepping closer. "You've been everything to me." His words hung in the air, heavy and charged. I turned away, busying myself with the laundry, but my hands trembled as I folded the shirts. I wanted to chalk it up to misplaced gratitude, the kind of admiration that came from someone who'd been through hell and back. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Then came the moments I couldn't explain away. One night, a winter storm knocked out the power, plunging the house into darkness. I lit a few candles and made hot cocoa to keep things cozy. Alex and I sat on the couch, wrapped in blankets as the wind howled outside. "Do you ever think about the past?" he asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "All the time," I replied, my thoughts drifting to memories of his father, the life we had before everything changed. Alex turned to me, his gaze intense. "You've set the standard so high," he said, his words catching me off guard. "I don't know if anyone else could ever make me feel the way you do." My breath caught. "Alex, you're still healing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "These feelings, they'll pass. It's natural to feel close to the people who care for you." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "It's not just that, Mom. It's more than that. You're everything I've ever needed." The raw vulnerability in his voice made my chest tighten. I wanted to dismiss his words, to chalk them up to the trauma he'd endured. But the way he looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and determination, made it impossible to ignore the undercurrent of something deeper. From that moment on, the tension between us became impossible to escape. Every glance, every touch, Every word seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been there before. I began to dread being alone with him, not because I didn't trust him, but because I didn't trust myself. The line between mother and son, once so clear, now felt blurred and fragile. And as much as I wanted to redraw it, to put distance between us, a part of me couldn't resist the pull of his unwavering devotion. It was a quiet evening when the boundaries between Alex and me began to blur in ways I couldn't ignore. The snow outside blanketed the world in silence, but the tension between us felt louder than ever. Alex had insisted on lighting the fire, his hands moving with a calm efficiency that belied the storm in my chest. When he turned to face me, his eyes held an intensity that made me catch my breath. "You've been amazing, you know that," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "I wouldn't have made it through without you." His words hung in the air, too heavy for the casual conversation we'd been having moments before. I smiled, trying to deflect. "That's what moms are for." But his gaze didn't waver. "It's more than that," he said, stepping closer. "You're more than that." I froze, unsure how to respond. Before I could find the words, he reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from my face. The gesture was gentle, tender, and far too intimate. My pulse quickened as his hand lingered, his touch sending a warmth through me that I couldn't explain or deny. That night, I lay awake long after Alex had gone to bed, my thoughts racing. His words, his touch, the way he looked at me, all of it replayed in my mind like a melody I couldn't escape. I told myself it was just his way of coping, a misplaced attachment born from his trauma. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I decided to shake off the unease by focusing on the mundane. I spent extra time brushing my hair, applying a touch of makeup, simple acts meant to ground me. When I came downstairs, Alex was already in the kitchen, sipping coffee at the counter. His eyes widened as I entered, his lips parting slightly. "Wow," he said, his voice filled with awe. "You look incredible." Heat rose to my cheeks as I brushed off his comment with a laugh. "It's just a sweater, Alex." "It's not the sweater," he said, his gaze unwavering. "It's you." His words sent a jolt through me, leaving me speechless. The sincerity in his voice, the way his eyes lingered, it was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before, and it scared me as much as it thrilled me. Later that day, as I was tidying up the living room, Alex appeared behind me. I didn't hear him approach, but I felt his presence, the warmth of him standing so close that it made my skin tingle. Before I could turn around, he wrapped his arms around my shoulders, his touch gentle yet firm. "You've been doing so much," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "You need to let someone take care of you for a change." "Alex," I said, my voice trembling, "I don't need taking care of. I've been doing this for years." "Maybe it's my turn now," he replied, his tone soft but insistent. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to my cheek, a touch so tender, so lingering, that it left me breathless. I wanted to pull away, to create space between us, but I couldn't move. My body seemed frozen, caught between fear and an unnameable thrill. That evening, as I prepared dinner, Alex disappeared for a while. When he returned, he was holding a bouquet of wildflowers, simple but beautiful. "For you," he said, his voice tinged with shyness. "I just thought you deserved something nice." I stared at the flowers, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Alex, you didn't have to." "I wanted to," he interrupted, his gaze steady. "You've done so much for everyone else. Let me do something for you." His words, so heartfelt and sincere, left me reeling. As I arranged the flowers in a vase, I could feel his eyes on me, his presence filling the room in a way that felt both comforting and unsettling. The next morning, he surprised me again. As I came downstairs, still groggy from a restless night, he held out his hand. "Dance with me," he said, his tone light but his eyes serious. "Dance?" I repeated, caught off guard. "It's not even 8 a.m. "It's never too early," he replied, his boyish grin impossible to resist. He led me to the center of the room, his hand warm and firm in mine. The music played softly in the background, a gentle melody that seemed to echo the emotions swirling between us. At first, we stumbled, laughing as our feet got tangled. But soon we found a rhythm, moving together with a grace that felt effortless. As the song faded, our movements slowed, becoming something quieter, more intimate. Alex's hand rested lightly on my waist, his other still clasping mine. He leaned down, brushing a kiss against my cheek. His lips lingered for a moment, soft and warm, before he pulled me into an embrace that felt both grounding and overwhelming. "You feel so good," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I closed my eyes, letting myself savor the moment, even as my mind screamed at me to pull away. But I couldn't. The connection between us, so fragile yet so intense, held me in place. And as much as I wanted to believe it was innocent, the way my heart raced told me otherwise. The turning point came on a quiet evening, one I would have otherwise forgotten if not for what followed. The storm outside had subsided, leaving the world coated in a thick blanket of snow. Inside, the house was warm, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Alex had insisted on lighting it earlier, a ritual that seemed to calm him. Now we sat together on the couch, a warm blanket draped across our laps. For a while we spoke of inconsequential things, childhood memories, stories of his father, and the winters we used to spend building forts in the snow. But as the conversation ebbed, a silence fell between us, one that felt heavier than it should have. "Do you ever feel like you're searching for something you'll never find?" Alex asked suddenly, his voice low. I turned to look at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "What do you mean?" I asked gently. He hesitated, his jaw tightening as if he were bracing himself. "I mean, someone who makes you feel safe. Seen. Someone like you." His words hung in the air, and my heart skipped a beat. "Alex, you're still healing," I said quickly, trying to deflect the weight of what he was saying. "These feelings, they're real," he interrupted, his voice firm. He shifted, turning to face me fully. "Mom, you don't understand. It's not just gratitude or admiration. It's more than that." I froze, my mind racing as I tried to process his words. "Alex, this isn't right," I stammered, my voice trembling. "You're my son." He leaned closer, his hand brushing mine where it rested on the couch. "I know what you're thinking," he said softly. "But I need you to know how much you mean to me. How much I love you." His confession left me speechless. I wanted to pull away, to create distance, but the intensity in his eyes held me captive. Before I could say anything, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was both hesitant and deliberate. I pulled back, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Alex, no," I whispered, my voice breaking. This can't happen." But he didn't move. Instead, he looked at me with an expression that was equal parts determination and desperation. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quietly. "I just needed you to know how I feel." I stood abruptly, the blanket falling from my lap as I moved to put distance between us. My heart was racing, my thoughts a tangled web of emotions I couldn't untangle. "I think you should go to bed," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching mine, before nodding slowly. "Good night, Mom," he said, his voice soft and filled with something I couldn't name. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as Alex's words replayed in my mind. His kiss, his confession, the way he looked at me. It all felt like a dream, or a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I told myself it was the trauma talking, that his feelings were misplaced, but deep down, I couldn't ignore the part of me that had responded to him. The part of me that felt something I shouldn't. The next morning, the tension between us was palpable. Alex acted as if nothing had happened, his demeanor calm and composed. But I could feel his eyes on me whenever I walked into the room, his gaze heavy with unspoken words. I tried to create distance, to re-establish the boundaries that had always been so clear. But every time I thought I had succeeded, something would happen to pull us back together. A shared laugh, a lingering glance, a touch that lasted just a moment too long. It was as if the universe itself was conspiring to keep us close. Then came the moment that changed everything. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Alex walked in. He didn't say anything at first, simply watching me as I worked. But then he stepped closer, his presence filling the room in a way that made my pulse quicken. "Can I help?" he asked, his voice soft. "I've got it," I replied quickly, trying to keep my focus on the task at hand. But he didn't leave. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing mine as he took the knife from me. "Let me," he said, his tone gentle but insistent. I froze, my breath hitching as his hand lingered on mine. The air between us felt charged, the tension thick enough to cut with the knife he held. "Alex, He turned to face me, his eyes searching mine. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "About how much you mean to me. About how much Alex, stop," I interrupted, stepping back. "This isn't right. You're my son." "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "But I can't help how I feel. And I don't think you can either." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was, I didn't know how I felt anymore. All I knew was that the line between us had been crossed, and there was no going back. The sound of the front door opening startled us both, breaking the moment. A neighbor had come to drop off a package, their cheerful voice calling out a greeting. The intrusion was enough to shatter the spell, and I took the opportunity to create space, busying myself with the meal. Alex left the kitchen without another word, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. I told myself it was over, that whatever had happened between us would fade with time. But as I stood there, my hands trembling and my heart pounding, I knew the truth. We had crossed into uncharted territory, and I wasn't sure if we'd ever find our way back. The morning after the kiss, the weight of what had happened was unbearable. I avoided Alex, staying in my room longer than usual, pretending to be busy with things that didn't matter. But no amount of avoidance could erase the memory of his words or the touch of his lips against mine. By the time I came downstairs, Alex was already in the kitchen, sipping his coffee and staring out the window. He turned as I entered, his expression unreadable. "Good morning," he said, his voice cautious as if testing the waters. "Morning," I replied curtly, avoiding his gaze. I busied myself with pouring coffee, my hands shaking slightly as I reached for the mug. The silence between us was thick, the kind of silence that wasn't just absence of sound, but the weight of everything unspoken. "I think we need to talk," Alex said finally, his voice low but steady. I froze, my heart racing as I gripped the counter. "There's nothing to talk about," I said quickly. "What happened last night, it was a mistake. It didn't mean anything." "It meant something to me," he countered, stepping closer. "You can't just pretend it didn't happen." I turned to face him, forcing myself to meet his eyes. "Alex, this isn't right," I said, my voice trembling. "You're my son. Whatever you're feeling, it's not real. It's just misplaced emotions because of everything you've been through." His jaw tightened and he looked away, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Don't tell me how I feel," he said quietly, his voice laced with frustration. "I know what I feel, and it's not going away." I wanted to argue, to push him away, but the vulnerability in his eyes made my chest ache. I couldn't bear to hurt him, but I also couldn't let this continue. "We need distance," I said finally. "You need time to sort out your feelings, and I need time to think." Alex didn't respond immediately. He stood there, his shoulders tense, his expression conflicted. "If that's what you want," he said eventually, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'll give you space. But it won't change how I feel." The next few days were tense and awkward. Alex stayed in his room most of the time, only coming out for meals. When we did cross paths, the air between us was thick with tension. I tried to focus on normalcy, on chores and errands, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every time I saw him, I was reminded of how much had changed, and how much I was to blame. One evening, the tension finally boiled over. I was sitting in the living room, trying to lose myself in a book, when Alex came in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Why are you pushing me away?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "Because I have to," I said, closing the book and setting it aside. "What happened between us, it was wrong. We can't let it happen again." "Why not?" he demanded, stepping into the room. "Because society says it's wrong? Because you're afraid of what people might think." "No, Alex," I said, my voice firm. "Because I'm your mother. And no matter how complicated things have become, that's a line we can't cross." He stared at me, his jaw tightening as if he were trying to hold back his emotions. "You're the only one who's ever truly been there for me," he said finally. "The only one who's ever made me feel seen, understood. How can I just ignore that?" His words cut deep, and I had no answer for him. I could see the pain in his eyes, the longing he couldn't hide, and it broke my heart. But I couldn't let my emotions cloud my judgment. "I love you, Alex," I said softly. "But not in the way you want me to." "I can't." The words seemed to shatter something in him. He turned away abruptly, his shoulders slumping as he walked toward the door. "I'll leave," he said, his voice strained. "Maybe that's what you need, to not see me for a while. Maybe then you'll figure out how you really feel." I wanted to call after him, to tell him he didn't need to leave, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I sat there in silence, tears streaming down my face as the sound of his footsteps faded down the hallway. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as guilt and regret consumed me. I had always prided myself on being strong, on making the right decisions for my family. But now I felt like I had failed, not just Alex, but myself. I had let things go too far, and now the damage was done. When I woke the next morning, Alex was gone. A note on the kitchen counter confirmed what I already knew. He had left to give us both the space we needed. I held the note in my trembling hands, my chest tight with a mix of relief and sorrow. Part of me knew it was the right thing, but another part ached at the thought of him being gone. In the days that followed, the house felt unbearably empty. I threw myself into work, into chores, into anything that would distract me from the silence. But no matter how busy I kept myself, I couldn't escape the memories, the stolen moments, the words we couldn't take back, the connection that had forever changed us. Alex's absence was a constant reminder of the line we had crossed, and the consequences we now had to face. I didn't know if time would heal the wounds we had inflicted on each other, but I hoped that someday we could find a way to move forward, separately but stronger. Weeks passed, but the ache in my chest didn't fade. The house was quiet now, devoid of Alex's presence. The absence of his laughter, his warmth, his energy, it all weighed heavily on me. I busied myself with routines, hoping the days would dull the sharp edges of my guilt and confusion. But no matter how much I tried to move forward, my thoughts always circled back to him. One evening, as the winter sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I found myself standing by the window, clutching a photo of Alex as a child. His smile in the picture was wide, unburdened by the complexities that had come to define us. I closed my eyes, letting the tears flow freely as I whispered into the empty room. I just wanted you to be happy. In the weeks since Alex had left, I'd had time to reflect. His feelings, as misplaced and forbidden as they were, had come from a place of pain and longing. He had been searching for comfort, for safety, and I had become his anchor. But in doing so, we had both crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. I knew I had to take responsibility for my part in it. I had let my own loneliness and vulnerability cloud my judgment. In the quiet moments, I asked myself difficult questions. Had I misread his actions? Had I unintentionally encouraged his feelings? The answers weren't easy, but they were necessary. One night, as I sat alone with a glass of wine, I decided to write Alex a letter. I couldn't let things end the way they had, with unresolved emotions hanging between us like a storm cloud. I needed to make things clear, not just for him, but for myself. Alex, I began, my pen trembling in my hand. You've always been my strength, my pride, my reason for pushing through even the hardest days. What we've been through together is something most people will never understand, and I'll always be grateful for the bond we share. But that bond has to remain what it was always meant to be, a bond between a mother and her son. I paused, my chest tightening as I wrote the next words. I know your feelings are real, and I will never dismiss them. But they come from a place of pain and vulnerability, and it's my responsibility to help you heal, not to blur the lines that define our relationship. You've been through so much, Alex, and I know it's hard to process everything. But I believe in you. I know you'll find someone who will love you the way you deserve to be loved. I folded the letter carefully, sealing it in an envelope before setting it aside. The act of writing it felt like a small step toward closure, a way to acknowledge what had happened while also setting firm boundaries. A week later, I received a message from Alex. It was short, but it brought a wave of relief I hadn't realized I was waiting for. Mom, I've been thinking about everything. I'm sorry for putting you in that position. I just needed to say it. I'm working through it, and I hope we can be okay someday. I love you. Tears filled my eyes as I read his words. It wasn't an easy resolution, but it was a start. I replied with a simple, heartfelt message. I love you too, Alex. Take all the time you need. In the days that followed, I began to feel lighter. The boundaries between us, though shaken, were starting to rebuild. I threw myself into hobbies I'd neglected, rekindling friendships I'd let fade over the years. Slowly but surely, I was rediscovering myself, separate from the identity of being Alex's mother. The experience, as painful and complicated as it had been, taught me invaluable lessons. I learned that love, even when it comes from a place of deep connection, must have boundaries. I learned that vulnerability can cloud judgment, and that healing requires both honesty and distance. Most importantly, I learned that mistakes don't define us, they shape us. They force us to confront our flaws, our fears, and our desires, pushing us to grow in ways we never imagined. As spring approached, melting the snow that had once cocooned the world in silence, I felt a renewed sense of hope. I didn't know what the future held for Alex or for me, but I knew we were both on paths toward healing. And as much as I wished things had been different, I was grateful for the clarity that had come from the pain. Life would go on, and so would we. And with time, I hoped we could find our way back to each other. Not as two people tangled in confusion, but as mother and son, bound by love and strengthened by the lessons we had learned. If you've ever faced a moment where love and boundaries became blurred, how did you handle it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories that dive into the complexities of human emotions. Stay tuned. Our next story will leave you questioning the fine lines between loyalty and betrayal.